So much, Armando, and it's wonderful. It is true. We have been through a lot together, but having someone with the kind of life history and commitment and profile of just both success and generosity and building an extraordinary family who themselves are so committed to this wonderful community. So a tribute to Armando and Maggie and all that they do and what they do for all of us. It's great to be with you to celebrate 50 years of work by the Miami Foundation, and we are so pleased that they have chosen to highlight what is a relatively new area of focus for them, and that is resilience. Since it began its work in 1967, we're so admiring of how much the Miami Foundation has done to improve the lives and the livelihoods of people in greater Miami. They've shown tremendous civic leadership, made really smart and strategic community investments, and have been wonderful philanthropists. So they've created more than 1,000 philanthropic funds, awarded more than $250 million in grants to build a greater and better Miami. Led by its fabulous CEO, Javier Soto, the foundation is really a wonderful and prominent civic leader in the South Florida community, and Javier gave you just a little bit of the landscape of some of the more recent initiatives, but it has been 50 years of really extraordinary progress and commitment. And I must say that we have never needed the ingenuity and impact of local community-focused institutions like the Miami Foundation more than we do today, because the communities they serve, especially in this region, must be adapted now to bend and not break. We must fit them to be more resilient given the new 21st century realities they are facing. During my time as president of the Rockefeller Foundation, my colleagues and I focused intently on helping institutions of all kinds, public and private, urban and rural, community-based and national, become more resilient. In other words, to better adapt and thrive in the face of a changing environment and the mounting shocks and stresses of a globalized world. We helped the city of New Orleans in the wake of Hurricane Katrina to rebuild, and we have worked to strengthen cities around the world in the face of rising sea levels and the consequences of climate change. We helped create resilient new agricultural systems globally and have launched a green revolution in Africa. We pioneered new financing tools to leverage private capital for public good, and we connected young people and marginalized community to 21st century jobs. Why is building resilience so important? Think of it this way. The world is racing towards a global population of 10 billion people, a five-fold increase in only 15 decades, and 75% of that population will be densely urban. A changing climate is pressuring the health of our planet and the well-being of our people. Globalization has resulted in security and economic challenges never before seen in human history. Because of these triple threats, globalization, urbanization, and climate change, disruption is coming faster and it's staying longer in every part of our lives. Not a week goes by that we don't see some kind of disturbance to the normal flow of things. A cyber attack, a new strain of virus, a structural failure, a violent fire, a civil conflict, or a terrorist attack, and of course, hurricanes. But must each crisis necessarily cause us to go down? Must crisis become the new normal? I want to persuade you today that not even every significant disruption has to become a disaster. The organizations, the businesses, the communities, and cities that are preparing most effectively for any crisis will rebound faster from every crisis. And they won't just bounce back more quickly, they can actually jump forward and transform. Resilience is defined as the capacity of any entity, whether it's you, an individual, or a community, or a natural system or a city, to prepare better for disruptions, to recover more rapidly and more effectively from shocks and stresses, and to actually adapt and grow from a disruptive experience. Resilience can be learned, it can be built, it can be invested in and practiced. Our work has discovered that there are 5 characteristics that all resilient entities share in times of crisis and times of calm. First, all resilient entities are highly aware of their vulnerabilities and their strengths. They have both the willingness and the capacity to continuously assess their situation in real time, to take in new information, and to adjust to changing circumstances using a variety of monitoring mechanisms and a variety of feedback loops. Second, all resilient entities are diverse. They have built-in redundancy in their most critical elements. They possess different sources of capacity and capabilities so that when one part of the system is challenged, the whole isn't compromised. Being resilient also means that you can draw upon a diverse range of ideas, of information sources, technical elements, or groups to keep things running and to restore normalcy faster. Third, all resilient entities are well integrated. They have the best capacity to coordinate functions and actions across all parts of their system. They're able to bring together disparate ideas and elements to work collaboratively and to develop cohesive solutions. Information is shared and communication is transparent. A fourth characteristic is the ability to self-regulate. As I said, to bend rather than break. It is the difference between failing safely and failing catastrophically. It relies on knowing when and how to decouple or island the part of the system that's in trouble to keep problems from cascading. And finally, all resilient entities are highly adaptive. They adjust and take new action in light of new information. They are nimble and flexible, and they can take on multiple functions or roles when needed. These are the characteristics that we will need to adapt and flourish in the complex, changing world of the 21st century. And perhaps there are fewer places in the country that are feeling urban resilience challenges more acutely than Miami. Having just dodged a direct hit by Irma, but still deeply impacted, of course hurricanes are front of mind. And with the next king tide predicted for November 5th-ish, it's hard to forget that rising sea level is regularly threatening local commerce and property. With these realities, building resilience will require not only piping and pumping, but hard and soft infrastructure investments that facilitate living with water in new ways, something in which New Orleans, New York, and Rotterdam and others are leading innovation. And while sea level rise and flooding are huge challenges, they are not the only factors that are weakening our region's resilience. Miami's rapidly growing population and accompanying economic boom have revealed the shortcomings of rapidly aging infrastructure, of inadequate public transit systems, and overcrowded highways. Miami is also challenged by too homogeneous a job industry and an over-reliance on property taxes as its main source of revenue. These are challenges to resilience. The sudden shocks and gnawing stresses from climate change, economic instability, and poor infrastructure jeopardize the stability of Miami's communities, and they threaten neighborhoods, livelihoods, and homes. To truly thrive, Miamians must better assess our vulnerabilities, and we must rebuild our capacities, focusing not only on our physical and natural infrastructure, but on the economic diversity and the social fabric of this region. And by doing so, we stand to gain at every part of the resilience building process. I am delighted that through the efforts of the Miami Foundation, working with the mayors of Miami, Miami-Dade, and Miami Beach, Greater Miami and the Beaches were selected last year to join the 100 Resilient Cities Network, which is a $200 to $300 million program funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. 100 Resilient Cities is helping 100 cities on 6 continents and 47 countries to better address, prepare for, and recover more quickly and effectively from the wide range of shocks and stresses that will be thrown at them in the 21st century, from sea level rise to rising social and economic inequality. In Miami, through this effort, you will see firsthand how resilience building can pay a dividend, yielding multiple returns on a single investment. Your Resilient Greater Miami and the Beaches team has been conducting intensive stakeholder engagement across Miami-Dade County and will now be working with 100 Resilient Cities staff, with your 3 local chief resilience officers who are here today, and great working with all 3 of you, and with working groups from government, nonprofits, businesses, and the academic sectors to focus on 6 areas that your working groups have identified as most critical for this region's 35 municipalities. Number 1, living with water, innovative infrastructure investments, and I emphasize innovative. Number 2, advancing and adapting with a strong focus on housing and transit. Number 3, building prosperity by creating an economy for all. 4, a thriving community focusing on safe and healthy neighborhoods. 6, robust recovery and pre-planning for disaster. And 6, what they are calling leadership for tomorrow, which is looking in that crystal ball and staying ahead of the curve. The Miami Foundation has served as a vital partner throughout the Resilient Greater Miami and the Beaches process. And we are so grateful to you, Javier, for chairing the Leadership Steering Committee. You will hear more about this work from the afternoon's panel, so I won't steal any more of their thunder. What I want to do instead is help you to imagine the possible results of their efforts, thinking forward at the end of this process. Imagine what could change if we invested FEMA and other government resources on measures that actually made households more resilient, not merely paying for the damages after the fact. We know that $1 spent on prevention saves an average of $4 in lower damages. Imagine the returns we could see beyond those in the form of lives saved or property protected. For example, new jobs created, better infrastructure, and building greater community assets. That's the resilience dividend. Imagine the returns if we took steps to screen all public investments going forward through a resilience building lens. To imagine how this works, let's just take one example. Think of our hard infrastructure investments. For example, there are many ways to build a bridge or a road, but only some of them currently use materials that have resilient characteristics. From roadways built or repaired with available materials that absorb water more quickly and release it more slowly, to bridges with 3D printed pilings that bend instead of break when the waves hit, to more diversified transit options in a given region, so that a blow to one type does not take all transit in the region down. Or a power grid. We need to think about this region's power grid, and you can rebuild a regional power grid with smart grid technology that regularly assesses and uses whatever source of energy is most available, thus reducing the dependence on fossil fuels, among other benefits. And with a smart switch in the grid, the power company would then be able to delink a piece of infrastructure that is failing so that a city or half a city doesn't plunge into darkness when just one section goes down. Imagine that. Such technology is available today. Just think of what a difference that would have made during and after Irma. Our work has shown that dividends can be achieved across all 3 phases of the resilience building process: readiness, recovery, and revitalization. Readiness starts with really good planning and preparation, not just for the last crisis, but for any crisis. Recall the Boston Marathon bombing for a moment. For a decade before that, The city of Boston had been planning for any type of emergency event, from hurricanes to blizzards to terror attacks. They conducted very complex, demanding preparatory exercises and simulations, and they used every large crowd Super Bowl, well, every large crowd celebration, but often Super Bowl parades to practice. This was coupled with tight coordination between multi-agency and multidisciplinary teams, including all the local service providers, media outlets, first responders, and medical officials, all playing off the same playbook. And so 18 minutes after the explosion, all red tag patients had been transported to Boston area hospitals, and nobody who was taken to a hospital died, which is really quite unusual in this kind of event. What's more, communications planning prevented the spread of digital rumors and fear-mongering on social media until critical systems were restored. As part of its resilience strategy, San Francisco has established a readiness model called its Lifeline Council. It's included, for example, its growing sharing economy businesses like Airbnb and Lyft in its planning, because their business model is essentially built on a resilience principle, the effective use of excess capacity. The Lifeline Council has integrated planning across public, private, and community organizations to facilitate self-regulation in the aftermath of a disruption, no matter what that disruption is: an earthquake, a severe weather event, an act of terrorism, and now the fires. And just as Boston has used large crowd celebrations to test its emergency responses, San Francisco annually uses Fleet Week, when the Navy comes on shore, to engage in preparedness exercises with its citizens, turning what was traditionally a week of pretty bad bar crawls into a practice opportunity that yields real benefits in terms of citizen engagement and community cohesion. That's the resilience dividend. Planning and readiness are critical, but you cannot always prevent bad things from happening. And when they do, recovery must not be based on the build-it-back mentality that has led to so many recoveries in our history. Instead, we must always focus on how to build it better. This concept drove the creation of Rebuild by Design in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut after Superstorm Sandy. Rather than simply using federal recovery dollars to rebuild what was there before, we helped HUD and FEMA launch a competition bringing together global and local design teams to develop recovery proposals with the impacted communities based on resilience building principles. One example is a 10-mile barrier that will be built to protect Lower Manhattan from future flooding. This area of Lower Manhattan, as I think you know, centers major financial institutions, and in some ways Wall Street and the World Trade Center are part of our national economic engine. But it also is home to vibrant neighborhoods and the fastest growing residential market in the country. That's a lot of lives and a lot of assets worth protecting. When you think of a flood barrier, you might envision quite an eyesore, and that's where things began. But working with experts, each community envisioned a very different type of construction, with spaces that would enable them to reap their own social and economic dividends from how the flood protection barrier was designed. Increased green space and places to gather, new bike paths to ease traffic congestion, infrastructure that doubles as art, and markets to bring economic development to underserved areas. That's the resilience dividend. Another Rebuild by Design project is transforming the region's approach to the New Jersey Meadowlands, a flood-prone marshland between Newark and New York City that was inundated by several feet of Sandy's storm surge. Development is now being prohibited in the most vulnerable spots where water will always seek to flow in order to actively prevent new construction. Protection from storm surges will occur by an intricate and quite attractive new system of berms that will also collect overflow rainfall to ease the burden on the drainage system in the further away surrounding towns. New built systems intersecting the berms will offer a wide range of recreation and transportation opportunities. Again, focusing on multiple wins for every single investment, not doing each thing seriatim and individually. Singapore solved for both too much and too little water in a single elegant solution. Its marina barrage was designed not only to prevent flooding, but to provide a freshwater catchment area for the city nation that had been so dependent on Malaysia for imported drinking water. What's more, the construction added green and natural infrastructure that embraces water rather than trying to fight it and keep it out, creating a park with breathtaking views and new water-related recreational opportunities. New housing and business investment and development has followed. Again, multiple wins for one investment. And this goes to my next point, that new forms of adaptation and growth must begin in the recovery process if recovery is necessary. In the final phase, revitalization. Perhaps nowhere have we seen a more intentional resilience-building approach to revitalization than in New Orleans. Now a case study for building resilience and the dividends it can generate. New Orleans used its recovery from Hurricane Katrina to transform its public education system, to diversify its economy, and to re-energize its neighborhoods. Today, the city is a magnet for talent and startups, and it's piloting innovative resilience-building projects to bring down crime rates and unemployment and to improve public health. And of course, it's focusing on hurricanes and sea level rise and flooding, but now in new and different ways, part of Louisiana's comprehensive master plan for a more sustainable coast. This post-Katrina multi-billion-dollar effort not only calls for a more extensive levee system, but it focuses especially and with great intentionality on soft infrastructure for more resilient adaptation, their version of living with water. The goal of this plan is not only to reduce the threat of flooding, but to fundamentally treat their coastline and the Mississippi River differently, with massive environmental interventions in order to treat the flooding problems at their root cause. Katrina forced them into resilience building, to be sure, but the lessons and the efforts of this region are worth learning from. Building resilience also requires new types of partnerships and new types of teamwork. It's about coming together both within cities and across them to cultivate solutions to threats that don't discriminate among us. For example, partnering with business and civil society leaders, Medellin, Colombia confronted decades of drug trafficking and crime and homicide by building transit systems that link the poorest and most vulnerable communities isolated in the hills down to the social and economic core in the middle of the city, using a gondola system and hillside escalators. Who would have thought that modes of transportation most commonly associated with fancy ski resorts or shopping malls would provide the connective tissue to spur economic integration, social cohesion, and improved response to disruption? But they did, and the results are undeniable. Medellin was once known as the murder capital of the world. It's now a vibrant city with a strong tourism economy, and the murder rate is down 90%. It's clear that social cohesion and citizen empowerment are key foundations of building resilience. Revitalization, though, isn't only a concept that applies to cities, but also to the institutions that provide the jobs and the economic activity on which our cities depend. We've seen it in businesses like Best Buy, reinventing and revitalizing themselves after they'd been knocked for a loop. Best Buy at the time was a small Minneapolis, St. Paul company called The Sound of Music. Its stores were wiped out by a major tornado in 1981. They could have closed. In fact, statistics show that 25% of business does not come back after a disaster. But instead, they threw out their old model, a model that had counters and high-pressure salespeople and offered home delivery. And instead, they pitched tents, they stacked all their inventory in the open, and they slashed their prices to the rock bottom. 2 years later, seeing how successful this strategy was, they rebranded as Best Buy with this new business model. And today, Best Buy is one of the largest electronics retailers in the world, and one of the most resilient in withstanding the onslaught of Amazon, according to reports only this year. Or look at Toyota. Before the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, the company had put resilience strategies in place that embodied these characteristics, from more integrated planning to an emphasis on self-regulation and self-determination quickly, to make decisions and decide without pushing it up the leadership chain what needed to be done, including first helping affected communities and only then getting production up and running. It saved lives, and it helped restore the functioning of producers all across their supply chain. It also produced remarkable innovations around new materials, new parts, and design when standard supplies were destroyed by the tsunami. Only 2 years later, Toyota regained its position as the #1 automaker in the world, even as Japan itself is still struggling to recover economically. Toyota's example makes it clear that businesses have a much bigger opportunity than just shoring up their own resilience strategies, although that is certainly the critical first step. They play an important role in contributing to the resilience of their communities as well, and in the 21st century, it may become a differentiating business imperative for success. According to an Economist survey, 90% of business leaders globally acknowledge that they have a role to play in building resilience, at least to climate change. And 75% of them think that they must look to cross-sector partnerships to address these challenges over the next 5 years. What a great role this is for a connector like the Miami Foundation. Let me give you an example of some excellent activities we've seen elsewhere in the world. Bavaria Brewery is owned by the global beverage company SAB Miller. It's located in Bogota, Colombia, and it's one of South America's largest breweries. But in the last few years, it found that the cost of water from the local utility was rising precipitously. The culprit? Because of climate change, upstream dairy farmers needed to clear more and more trees for their cows to graze. And without the plant roots to hold the soil back along the riverbeds, sediment was flowing downstream, disrupting Bogota's water supply and driving up the cost of water. SAB Miller might easily have moved the plant to another place, with the potential loss of a major local economy and employer in Bogota. But instead, they joined with local community groups, the water utility, and the Nature Conservancy to support the dairy farmers in adopting new practices. For example, purchasing higher producing cows, allowing them therefore to keep smaller herds, and taught them how to protect the trees and vegetation on the riverbanks. Through this partnership investment in watershed protection, the water utility saved millions of dollars a year, with SAB Miller as well as local households getting reduced costs on their water purchases. But that wasn't all. With better practices, the dairy farmers significantly increased their own efficiency and livelihoods, and the ecology and ecosystem of the river improved. Multiple wins for a single investment. That's the resilience dividend. And finally, while physical and economic and ecological resilience are incredibly important, we can't become fully resilient without focusing on the social fabric that knits us together or forces us apart. The importance of social resilience was clear in the Chicago heat wave of 1995, which killed 739 people. What was particularly significant about the mortality rate was that most of it seemed to fall along economic lines, something that we see all over the world. But two communities, Englewood and Auburn, Neighboring communities, Englewood saw 33 deaths per 100,000. Auburn Gresham, by contrast, had only 3 deaths per 100,000. The difference? Auburn Gresham had sidewalks and stores. It had community organizations. People walked the streets and they were active in community groups. Neighbors knew neighbors and they knew where to turn in times of crisis. Englewood was a different story. Its social cohesion had left, along with the commercial retailers and half the population over the previous 30 years. As Eric Kleinenberg, the sociologist who conducted this research, noted, living in a neighborhood, a good, socially cohesive neighborhood like Auburn Gresham, is the rough equivalent of having a working air conditioner in each room. An AP poll that questioned more than 2,000 people impacted by Superstorm Sandy in the greater New York region echoed these findings years later. 1/3 of all respondents said that they had reached out to nearby friends, family, and community groups for assistance, far more than turned to the government for help in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. The poll also found that neighborhoods that were lacking in social cohesion, the bonds that encourage neighbors to check on neighbors in times of stress, those neighborhoods are recovering more slowly than neighborhoods with similar amounts of destruction but greater social cohesion. Building this social cohesion often starts with planning that intentionally emphasizes developing and reinforcing positive community interactions. That's why civil society organizations funded by the Miami Foundation and led by so many of you here are so important. Today, both Melbourne, Australia, and Copenhagen, Denmark, measure the vibrancy of their civil society organizations as well as more traditional metrics, such as economic growth, in determining how well they are performing as cities. But translating our approaches to building resilience is also the responsibility of individuals, of our individual citizens, and your organization and your leadership must redouble your efforts to enable and empower individuals at every level to act here. Ernest Hemingway once wrote, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward many are stronger at the broken places. But with resilience thinking and practice, we don't have to wait for the world to break us, to make us stronger, to build more inclusive economies or build better communities." I've shared with you examples of cities, of institutions, of communities that are rising to the challenges and unleashing the opportunities of the resilience age. But it will take all of you working together across sectors, across communities, across ideologies to ensure that Greater Miami can both avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable. In these turbulent times, we have no other choice, and we are grateful that the Miami Foundation and so many of you here are helping to lead the way. Thank you. And it's great to be a fellow Miamian with you in this journey, so lots of personal attention if you'd like it. We have some time for questions. I was told that they're going to pass around microphones for anyone who has a question. Just identify yourself and ask away. I honestly can't see, so why don't you hand it to, and if you would stand up, that'd be great.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. My name is Giada Nicola. I'm a professor and a psychologist at University of Miami. Great admirer of you and what you stand up for, many of us women in the academy, so thank you. I'm here also in the capacity as a person who co-founded a foundation, the very first in Haiti, called the IT Community Trust in partnership with the Miami Foundation. And so we've had a lot of time to think about resiliency and talk about resiliency and begin to think about the implication for all that means. And so one of the questions I have for you is, as we think about resiliency, oftentimes when we have to write our problem statement and our rationale for why is it that we do what we do, as many of us here who runs organizations who needs to apply for funding, oftentimes you have to talk about the deficits, right, that exist in these communities. It always seems to be like a level of cognitive dissonance to talk about the horribleness of the people, and at the same time, they need to talk about resilience. And I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about how do one address this sort of cognitive dissonance that may exist.
So I think in our 100 Resilient Cities competition, we really did try to address that. It's important to tell you that we had 1,100 cities across the world apply, and we were only able to select 100. And we didn't choose the places that were most resilient. We chose the places that were able to understand how to diagnose both their deficits and their strengths, and to be able to talk articulately in the application about how they could leverage the strengths at the same time they were reducing the deficits. That was threshold 1. Threshold 2 is we only picked places where they had committed to or previously shown real cross-sector collaboration. And so, as you know, it is really exciting, and maybe one of the first times that we are seeing this extent of collaboration among Miami-Dade, Miami, and Miami Beach, and across sectors that involve the business community, civil society organizations, the academy, as well as government. This is everyone's opportunity. And so the cities that were really able to focus on how to turn this into greater opportunity building. I called my book The Resilience Dividend for a reason, and you heard the theme echoed over and over again. What has been so frustrating working around the world is seeing the amount of money spent on investments that only yield a single win. And so if you reframe the narrative and you start thinking in different ways, even just collaborations across units of the same municipal government, you know, the building department has this pot of money, and the transit department has that pot of money, and the recreation department has a third. And yet, if you start thinking through a resilience framework and you're doing your planning together, you can often invest in one thing that will yield all three benefits, therefore saving 2/3 of the money to do other things with. It is really a potential win to reframe the way this is being thought about. Yep, let's get a microphone here. I'm sorry, we'll take a question here and then we'll get a microphone next. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. So Adriana Machado with the Impact Economy Foundation. A question. Have you thought of blockchain as a technology to unlock investments, since you're talking about innovations to build the resilience strategy?
So we're actually funding an organization that's using blockchain for Syrian refugees, because often they come out without money or any kind of identity, and so creating a safe identity through blockchain has been a way to start rebuilding their capacity to adapt to a new region and obviously to begin to succeed. And through that effort, we have started to see the benefit of this technology, as well as many other fintech technologies that really can add to the armamentarium of resilience building capacities. Paul and I were in the Bay Area for the last few weeks, and I spent a day in Silicon Valley visiting some various new technologies, from distributed energy companies to a group of engineers that's using artificial intelligence and machine learning to build models that predict vulnerability to hurricane and earthquakes and flooding by looking at actual infrastructure, not doing weather predictions. And so all sorts of new technologies that really, I think, will enable resilience building to take another leap forward as a capacity. I mentioned 3D printing. So these are expensive technologies. 3D printing is cutting the cost of many, many things by a tenth. In New York, in the recovery from Sandy, we actually, all of the piers that got rebuilt all along both the East River and the Hudson are being rebuilt using 3D printing, which rather than cement, which is what we had, and they cracked in the storm. And these actually do bend with wave action. So, and it was a tenth of the cost of what we had originally imagined. So these things are here. They're being used now. Your chief resilience officers are part of a network of people all over the world who know lots and lots about what's being done everywhere. This won't be reinventing the wheel, and you won't make mistakes that others have made because they are learning from where the successes are as well as where the failures have been. And it's one of the magic parts of being part of this initiative.
Hi, Rachel Silverstein with Miami Waterkeeper. One of the things that our organization has been pushing for is greater resiliency in things like sewage infrastructure as we make big investments in that infrastructure. And one of the issues we've run into is the cost argument, that it's just too expensive to do things differently, but also that a lot of these plans have already been in the works for 10 years or more, and changing them now is almost, people are telling us, almost impossible. Do you have any advice on how to sort of overcome the stasis and trying to sell these alternative multiple bottom lines that people don't usually consider in these kinds of infrastructure projects?
I think it is often hard, although not impossible, to change something that's already physically half-built, although there may be ways to do that, but things in design phase, for example, there is no answer that says you can't. So I was asked by Governor Cuomo to chair the commission that led New York State's recovery after Sandy. And they already had the plans for and the bids out for redoing the one of the big bridges. Why am I forgetting what's the bridge above the Triborough? The Tappan Zee, thank you. I'm in my Miami state of mind. So the bids were already out and the plans generated, the engineering work done for the Tappan Zee Bridge. We stopped that. It was redesigned. It is the first truly resilience framework built bridge. And we're already, it just reopened and we're getting visitors from all over the world. So he was willing, it takes some political bravery, to stop something that was pretty far along. But that was an emergency situation. What I'm hoping is that we won't need to get to an emergency before we wake up in all of these things. But hard infrastructure is not the only solution. We are surrounded by so much water. And what the lessons are from around the world about how to live with water. You know, the 20th century, the motto was pave, pipe, pump. That is not the 21st century motto. It cannot be. We cannot do sufficient work with that kind of hard infrastructure and have this region in particular reduce its vulnerability sufficiently. So again, wonderful work from around the world, lots and lots to learn from, but we need government officials, community organizations, business leaders, and active citizens to say, we need to do this differently. Money, Norfolk was in the first cohort of cities. We chose them 30-ish, 33, so that we would learn. So they're far ahead in having finished their resilience strategy. And we were pleasantly surprised when they got their latest municipal bond rating from Moody's, that Moody's actually raised their municipal bond rating, even though they said that sea level was rising and they were highly vulnerable. because they had a resilience strategy and were beginning to make resilience investments. So we think it could actually lower the cost of capital, at least municipal bond funding, for many of the cities, and we think that's critical. But there are, there are 147 global infrastructure funds, private capital, looking to make investments. They have stayed out of the United States largely. If we look at Canada, there's huge investment going on there by private investment infrastructure companies because they have much more differentiated capital budgets. You can figure out the ROI more effectively. They have better resilience strategies, and they can give greater certainty to business and private investors that there really is some outcome that they can find predictable. So again, this is a combination of the right policies, the right strategies, and then the right actions, where everybody has to do, every sector has to do something differently than the way they're currently doing it. That's what will lead to successful outcomes. Javier, you stop me when you have to go on. Maybe one last question.
You're so impressive. Thank you so much. I'm an immediate fan of yours. I have a question with all these coastal communities in particular and the fact that it's not just sea level rise, it's freshwater insecurity. I'm all about the climate, so I focus on that. My question is vulnerability of the human population that has no economic safety net. And I wonder if the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities effort is looking at that, because, you know, we always hear what is government responsibility and what's the individual's responsibility. But in Miami, the haves and the have-nots, there's a humongous divide. And telling people to prepare or to do what they can do is becoming a huge problem here in Miami. And both the county commission and the nonprofits are kind of pointing at each other going, we're doing a lot and we're doing a lot. And I think everybody's doing a lot, but we have 1.5 million people that have no economic safety net. How do we address that?
So everybody doing a lot alone isn't the right strategy. The right strategy, and that's why this effort that Javier has led the steering group for, that now will expand even further, is so important, because you need to be leveraging one another's interventions and resources, and not pointing fingers at one another. But let me give you an example from Da Nang. We worked in Da Nang very closely, and if you picture Vietnam, it's long and skinny, and it has virtually all coastal communities, except for a few in the middle on a river. And so it was a very interesting effort, and we began working there right after Katrina and New Orleans. And you can really focus if you're working together with all the sectors, and poverty and vulnerability is one of your lenses on how to do things differently. And I'll give you two quick examples and then conclude. Vietnam is all about economic development, and Da Nang was building a series of very high-end hotels funded by European and American hotel chains all along its coast, and everyone was quite excited by it. As we began the resilience strategy work with them, we were looking at land mass and water flow and the like, and it was very clear that right behind the coastline, there was a string of highly vulnerable, poor communities. And given the way the water flowed, twice a season anyway, they got inundated. But with the new construction, it would double or triple their vulnerability. To their credit, the government of Da Nang pulled the projects. They resurfaced and realigned how they put the natural infrastructure before they allowed further built infrastructure along the coastline. So it's doable first with the right information and then the political and social will. But we were working there and we thought we knew so much. And we watched the local fishermen get wiped out twice a year by the monsoons. And we thought they were pretty dumb because when the storm whipped up the seas, they would stay out too long. Rather than telling them what they were doing wrong, we spent some time talking with them, and they said, no, no, it's a great strategy because as the wind whips up the seas, the fish are much more easily caught. And so we try to stay out as long as we can. Well, rather than preventing that as part of the resilience strategy, we worked with them at their suggestion and the government and local community foundations, and we built an electronic winch system along the coastline so that they could hook their boats on it, stay out as long as they felt they needed to, and then get in really quickly so that their boats and their livelihoods weren't destroyed twice a year. So resilience building strategies require the knowledge that the communities have themselves about what they need and what they know. Doing it for them rather than with them is a really bad strategy. So I leave you with this thought. This is not what you do to them. This isn't what you do for them. This is what you do with them and with one another. And in that way, you will build resilience. Thank you.